You're listening to Sasquatch Syndicate.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my sensor light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard.
And all the ape believers don't want any of the paranormal believers to say anything because they're all whacked and screwed up, and we don't want them. And all the paranormal believers don't want to go to the ape believers saying, well, you're all closed-minded. You're not open to the fact that it does this and it does that.
And I look over my left shoulder, and this creature is running through the woods, and it's bulldozing the brush down. And I knew, man, this thing is going to get me.
Welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate. I'm your host, Chuck, out in Seattle, Washington, along with Paul in Portland, Oregon. Thanks to everyone for listening and those following us at SasquatchSyndicate.com and on our social media outlets. Happy November, everyone. We hope you're having a wonderful fall season and are ready for the holiday festivities ahead. With us tonight on Sasquatch Syndicate, we're joined by one of the original four horsemen of the topic of Sasquatch, Mr. Peter Byrne. Peter was born in Ireland, and following service in the Royal Air Force during World War II, Peter went to northern India to work on a tea plantation. Peter discovered his first Yeti footprint in Nepal in 1948. In 1953, he started his own safari company, which he ran for 18 years. In 1957, Peter embarked on a 3-year expedition to hunt down and track the Yeti. The expedition was funded by Texas oilman Tom Slick. In 1960, Peter headed another expedition to uncover Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. His team included founding members of the genre, such as John Green and Rene Dahinden. In 1968, Peter co-founded the International Wildlife Conservation Society and still serves as the executive director to this very day. In the 1990s, Peter devised the Bigfoot Research Project, which was clearly ahead of its time. It was focused on the full-scale scientific investigation centered on proving the existence of Sasquatch. The Mount Hood, Oregon-based operation was clearly leaps and bounds ahead in its use of helicopters, state-of-the-art infrared sensors, and even a 1-800-BIGFOOT phone number. So Peter, certainly an honor to have you on the show tonight. Thanks so much for joining Sasquatch Syndicate. And if you wouldn't mind sharing how you got into research for our listeners.
Well, it started for me in and I was in the Himalayas for 3 years, 57, 58, 59, and sponsored by the Texan Tom Slick from San Antonio in research and search for the Yeti. And spent 3 years up there, and then came down in December at the end of 59, and there's a cable saying, you've been up there long enough, would you like to come to the States and look for this thing called the Sasquatch? And I hate to say it, but I laughed at the time because I'd never been to the States, and to me it was America was skyscrapers and that sort of thing. Anyway, I came over here, met with Slick in San Antonio, and we pulled out maps of the Pacific Northwest, which amazingly proved to be bigger than the Himalaya in extent. So I started in January 1960, Northern California. We set up a base, got staff and officers and vehicles and equipment, and I was there for 2.25 years, January 1960 to October 63, when Tom Slick died in an air crash. And that it came to an end, and the family withdrew the project. And I went back to Nepal, where I was living, where I had a safari company in big game hunting. So that was the beginning for me. I came in and out of it for years, and then in the 90s I had a second full-time project, 92 to 97, and then in between smaller projects and smaller investigations. And that brings me pretty much up to the present day, when right now it's more of a hobby and not full-time, and investigating sightings and working with cameras in certain areas where there's been credible sightings. So that sort of covers it.
So, Peter, I know many of the listeners out there, of course, are fans of your work, and I wanted to make sure I represent you in the correct light this evening. And I believe, Peter, that there's a misconception that you also had done a lot of research on the Florida skunk ape, but that's not necessarily true, correct?
The skunk ape, a fellow asked me to make a documentary, and he said, would you go down there for 6 months? And I said, no, I'll go down for 1 month. So I spent 30 days in Florida and made a little documentary on the skunk ape. So it wasn't really research. It wasn't very long at all. It was just 30 days. So I can't say that I've done work on the skunk ape, just this film, that's all.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because I had heard, different programs and other folks kind of misrepresent you as kind of a cryptid expert in all areas, related to human primates. And I believe your primary focus was still in the Himalayas on the Yeti, as well as later on the Sasquatch there in North America. But getting back to the Himalayas, can you share a little bit just about that experience and what you found? The audience would definitely be fascinated to hear.
Yes, we found in a temple in the Silicambu region, we found a scalp that they had, that the monks, the lamas in the temple had, and we photographed that and examined it, and we asked them if they would let us take it to England to be examined. They said no. And then later on, in the same temple, by accident, we found that they had a hand, which they said was the hand of a Yeti. They said it was 100 years old, and they showed it to us. And we managed to get, after a lot of bargaining, 2 fingers of that and get them back to England, where a paleontologist who was working with us examined the fingers and said that he didn't know what they were. He didn't think they were human. And so those are the 2 findings we made in that area in Nepal. And I think that was probably 1959, 58 or 59.
So, Peter, you've stayed in this for many decades, and you've done a lot, you've published a lot, but for those that want to follow in your footsteps, where would you guide them?
Well, I suppose the principal part of that would be the books I've written. I've done 2 books on Bigfoot, one in 1975, and then another one recently, bringing everything up to date. And then I've done a book on the Yeti. I've written and published 20 books, but those 2 books cover the Yeti part of my life and the Bigfoot part, and they're available for people. So this is something I should be leaving behind, shall we say, as part of the legacy. Probably not much else, because I'm not a collector. I own very little. I own the cabin that I live in, and photograph albums and journals, and that's about it. I've never been a person to gather material things.
So, Peter, I know many of the listeners are fans of your work over the years on different programs, and you've had a lot of different experiences, but do you want to share some of the highlights and lowlights in research for our listeners?
On the Yeti expeditions, we found footprints 2 or 3 times, small footprints of a small primate, 5 or 6 inches long. And then the Sherpas we interviewed, the Tibetans, they indicated something about 4 feet in height. The same thing with Bigfoot. I found, or been involved in the finding of 5 sets of footprints over the last few years. And I've never seen one, but it's something entirely different. It's a huge primate. Its habitat is the Pacific Northwest here. I think it's very real. Taking good plaster casts and photographs of those footprints, but nothing else. No hair, no bones, nothing at all. And then, as you probably know, there's also no still photographs, not a single one. There's one piece of footage shot in 1967 by two men from Washington, Patterson and Gimlin, and it's quite remarkable. And I and my sponsors have spent a lot of money analyzing it, looking at it, and we think it's real.
So, Peter, I know that you've spent a lot of time tracing the Sasquatch Bigfoot lore and its history, but can you share a little bit with the listeners really how far back you really found the stories to go?
I was research on the Sasquatch. We've come up with a history, traced it back to 1785, through Native American tribes, through settlers and miners and missionaries, and then the footprints, and then the 1967 film, and then eyewitness reports, right up to the present day. Right up to 3 weeks ago, we have a report of a sighting. So that's the background on the Sasquatch mystery, if you want to call it that.
So, Peter, maybe you could talk a little bit about just kind of the beginning, right? And some of your different colleagues and other folks you had worked with over the years. But
well, I hate to say it, but most of my colleagues have passed away. My brother and Tom Sick and all his people, they've all passed away. The people I went on the expeditions with are all gone. It's just, it's an age thing, sadly. And
yeah, I'm sure that a lot of the listeners may not know exactly how old you are, but they can look that up online for sure. But, what are you up to these days? And, what would you like to see in the research community going forward?
Nowadays, I work with a small group in Oregon here. There's half a dozen of us. And we work with motion sensor cameras in areas where there have been incredible sightings. But from those days, in England, I have an RAF buddy, one man. We're the same age, and that's about it. But of the people who were associated with me in the Yeti expeditions and in the Bigfoot way back in the 60s, there's nobody around anymore. They've all passed away, I'm afraid.
So, Peter, I know you've done a lot of work in television, public radio, media productions, as well as literary works, but what's your real passion and where do you find the most comfort?
Well, writing. I've enjoyed writing. I wrote one book in 1975 and then grew discouraged by being turned down by publishers, and then started rewriting 12 years ago, and wrote literally every day right up until 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I published my last book, my autobiography, and I've enjoyed that. Because among other things for me is making a record, especially in Southeast Asia. I was in Asia. I was in India when it was British. It was a British colony, and that's a long time ago. But I was in my books, though, especially those that are centered in India. I was able to make a record of those times, and I think that was important.
So, Peter, obviously living in Oregon, you've probably seen a lot over the years, in terms of the Sasquatch and Bigfoot phenomenon, kind of going from kind of, an undiscovered primate to entertainment to an economic brand. But how do you feel that the subject is perceived today? Do you think folks still take it as serious as they once did?
Most nowadays, a lot of people do. I occasionally meet a skeptic. Occasionally, and usually it's someone who's done no reading, no studies. They dismiss it with a wave of their hand and say, a large hairy monster, rubbish, they don't exist. But for the most part, there's tremendous interest in Oregon here, and it seems to be growing. And certain things will boost it. For instance, we have what's called 7-man sighting from last year. In June last year, 7 working veteran loggers saw one all together at midday, and they stopped work and watched it walking towards them. And one of them is a personal friend of mine, a thoroughly reliable man. So that went in the news, went out a bit, and that helps to dispel skepticism, to where a great deal of belief in the phenomenon in Oregon and Washington just now, and in British Columbia to a certain extent.
Well, again, it's been a privilege and honor to speak with you live, and I know our listeners certainly appreciate it as well. But are there any parting thoughts for those getting started in research? What would you recommend?
It depends how they want to get started. If you're going to do something big, like a big project, and have plenty of money to spend, then there's all sorts of things they can do nowadays. Use of helicopters, use of drones, motion sensor cameras, which are excellent. The ones we use will take up to 2,000 pictures, bright, clear, good color, that sort of thing. I would suggest, but for people who are just going out on their own, and maybe it's a weekend, the best advice is carry a good camera with you and be prepared to use it, something like that.
So there you have it from Peter Byrne. Again, Peter, thanks so much for coming on Sasquatch Syndicate. We really appreciate it. I know our listeners do as well. And from the entire community and genre, I'd like to say thank you so much for your work over the years. It's certainly appreciated to keep the topic relevant. So please stay safe. We wish you good health, and may peace be your journey.
My pleasure.
I'm going to close the show a little bit differently tonight because a lot of people have written in that they're out there struggling, going through financial difficulties, relationship problems, and other things. But I want you to know we've got to stay positive and keep moving forward. Until next time, believe. This concludes our November 2019 podcast. Sasquatch Syndicate will return on Sunday, December 1st. Thanks to all of our listeners and those that have been out to our website and those following us on social media. Sasquatch is a controversial subject, so for all the believers and disbelievers, and those that will tell you they have all the answers, just remember, we're flying through space at 700 miles per hour. Buckle up.